All right, so this is where I try to sound smart. Yeah, I try to sound smart. Remember I holded up this book, Austerity: The History of a Dangerous Idea. This is the guy who actually came up with that whole idea, Mark Blyth. And you can actually check out his podcast that he does on the Watson Institute, which is actually pretty fun. Yes, he makes a joke, and he sounds like Michael Myers from Shrek. Yeah, I don't know if he's gonna make that joke today, but like that's one of his biggest things. But I've had some other videos in the past where I go over his work and some of the things that he did. Check him out, look it up. It's actually one of the videos where surprisingly it did pretty good. But for me, pretty good is anything more than 10 views. But let's hear it.
Welcome to the third episode of our podcast. I'm Jorge Tamames, and this time we have a special end of the summer edition episode coming from the other side of the Atlantic, where Aidan Reagan just interviewed Mark Blyth. Mark Blyth is the, bear with me because this is a mouthful, William R. Rhodes Professor of International Economics at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. He has researched for a long time now the relationship between economic ideas and the policies they produce in the real world. He has made a series of doomsday but ultimately accurate predictions, such as Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, and published several books. Some of them are Great Transformations, The Future of the Euro, co-edited with Matthias Matix, and Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, which was selected among the Financial Times' best books of 2013. In the prologue of that book, Mark makes the claim that academics should ultimately act as the bullshit police, calling out bad ideas for what they are when they take place in public debate.
Literally, that's part of the shit that he says. He literally is that economics professor that calls out bullshit. But I digress.
As we'll see throughout the course of this conversation, however, bad economic ideas have a habit of persisting even when they've been disproven or proven to be wrong or disastrous. Throughout the course of this conversation, Aidan and Mark talk about the politics of central banks and public debt, climate change, populism, the left, the radical right, the interplay between economic ideas and class politics, Donald Trump, Jeremy Corbyn, Matteo Salvini, how nobody cares about inflation, the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, and the problems it has brought for the left, as well as the future of the European Union.
Damn, that's a lot to have a conversation with in 30 minutes. Unfortunately, the way Mark Blyth is, yeah, it can be done. But let's continue.
So, Mark, you're internationally known for somebody who's an expert in economic ideas and the power of economic ideas over policy making. How did you get into this? What's the background to your interest in economic ideas?
So the usual answer I give to this one is I left Great Britain in 1991 because of a woman, Mrs. Thatcher.
Yeah, he has a lot of dad jokes. Okay. Never said he was funny. Just said he was corny and he was interesting as a professor.
And that's kind of the answer. So let's go back to, I think it was 1981. And there was a British program, which I think is still going on, called Panorama. And I would watch Panorama when I was 13 because I was a geek. And they had this amazing show where it was kind of like a game show between two economists. And this is the first time I'd ever come across economists or anything like this. So one of them was an old bloke who's in his 50s, who's got a tweed jacket and a daft haircut. And he was from, I think, the Manchester University or someplace like this. And he was the Keynesian. And they talked about his model, which had 6,000 equations and tried to model the household sector and the financial sector, blah, blah, blah. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And then the other side was this bloke wearing a very nice suit who was about 30 years old, who just looked like one of Thatcher's children. And he was from London Business School. And he had a monetarist model, which had about 6 equations. And I was like, what's going on here? And they ran data through it, and basically, you know, this one would say this and this. And what was amazing about the monetarist one was no matter what happened, the answer was tax cuts, and the result was nirvana.
And this is one of the not Morgan Freeman, but Freeman's little school of, hey, tax cuts solve everything, which they fucking don't. And no, everything would be great if we cut taxes on the fucking rich, which it's not. And this is the importance of always fighting, because the Keynesians let up, which was already a compromised position. And look, we had roughshods all over it.
And I was 13 and I thought to myself, that's bullshit. That's total bullshit. But I could see immediately how powerful this was. So right there and then was the moment when I started to pay attention to economics, not as a way of explaining the world, but as a thing in the world which in and of itself is politically powerful. So that's really the moment it came from. In Great Transformations, in the preface, I also talk about a moment with my dad, where, you know, we're driving down the road. I wasn't raised by my father, so, you know, times in the car with him are few and far between, so they stick in the memory. And we're talking about the upcoming 83 election. And this guy, from every possible conception, he was a butcher in the city slaughterhouse, right? I mean, this guy was as working class as you get. He should have been a Labour man, but he never was. He was the classic sort of angel in marble, as the British political science literature had it, the working class conservative. And I said, why wouldn't you, vote for this? He says, well, they're worried about unemployment, and that's something to worry about. There's a lot of people around here who don't have jobs. But what they'll do is they'll borrow all this money and they'll spend it, and people will think that they're rich. And then they'll spend all that money, but it won't really change anything, and all there will be is inflation, and you're back to square one, and then the government's got less money to do the stuff it needs to do. And, we've been through this before. That's what the 70s was, and, you just can't do that anymore.
So he actually explains what happened in the 70s. Inflation. The problem is we're no longer in the 70s, and what happened in the 70s was an actual issue where we had a lot of closed markets. And so what ended up happening is, in different countries, almost simultaneously across the world, you had workers always asking for more pay, and then prices would actually rise in order to compensate the workers for more pay. And because the workers wanted more pay, then what ends up happening is the prices will rise. And so they needed to have more pay to buy more stuff. And you had out of control inflation as a one-time thing. Now, it wasn't really as bad as a lot of people actually said it, but it started hurting people's profits. And in a nationalized market, when a closed national system, not nationalist, but a national system, there's only so much that the top of your market can actually get before it hits critical mass. That's why you see places like Venezuela, where they're mostly a closed national market, where prices start going out of control. But let's continue.
So right there is the long-run neutrality of money thesis, the supply-side dominance thesis, the monetary dominance thesis, all coming out of the mouth of a butcher. And I thought, wow.
So you can see the attraction, right, of tax cuts, more money in the pocket. It's attractive to all classes, right, to a certain extent, anybody who's working. But why then do bad ideas persist? Because you've written a lot about this, because particularly in the aftermath of the financial crisis, why do bad ideas persist? Bad economic ideas persist?
Because the definition I give in that book, Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, is the subtitle is there for a reason. They're a dangerous idea because they're immune to empirical refutation. It doesn't matter how many times you show that recessions cause damage, that they lower long-run growth trajectories, that the hysteresis effect in labour markets, i.e. you lose skills and you never get your lifetime earnings, has massive effects across generations. It still pops up that, no, really, the problem is just like a family that spent too much and we all need to tighten our belts, etc., etc. And the reason behind that is simple class politics. Those who are the creditor classes don't want to lose, and the debtors want to have their debts relieved. And that's the basic standoff, a creditor-debtor standoff that happens anytime there's a financial crisis. So, there's a class politics behind it, but what to me is interesting is how that gets played out in the realm of ideas, and why certain ideas such as the state's just like a family, spoiler alert, it's not. Expansionary austerity, the idea that if we cut budgets now, then what will happen is we'll have a bad recession, true, but it'll be short because that'll show we're serious about long-run taxes. And because I'll have less taxes to pay in the future, I'll run out to IKEA now, buy a couch and cure the recession. That's basically what the argument is.
So, like, if it was one thing that I would say that was actually beneficial about the original George Bush tax cuts is he gave people $400, $600 to go spend money right away. And what happened was people spent money. Now it helped a system that was already crashing stay a little bit more fluid for a longer period of time. But in the end, nobody says they cutting taxes, so let me go spend a shit ton of money. That's not what happens. Now, another thing, and like, one other thing that people always seem to forget, if people like me who are workers don't have any, free money to spend, businesses aren't spending any money, then that causes a recession that dries up money to be spent. The only people that can actually spend money with impunity is the fucking government, But, we need to cut taxes and spending of governments. But funny, that never affects the military budget because of reasons.
With lots of math. And these arguments become very powerful, and they caused an enormous amount of damage in Europe in the period of the financial crisis. So yeah, they don't die. John Quiggin calls them zombie ideas, and I think it's another nice way of putting it.
So the ideas, as you say, are connected to a kind of class politics. But I suppose if one thinks, it's easy to look back now and observe the extent to which the state intervened to save the financial system and the trillions that were effectively committed to bailing out the private sector. But it is remarkable to think that very quickly that shifted towards the household, that suddenly the state was to blame. Is there something to be said that the left in particular doesn't have the language or a discourse to talk positively about the role of government and the state in the economy anymore?
Oh yeah, that's a huge issue. I mean, one way of thinking about the past 30 years of that entire period from when I watched Panorama as a kid right until now has been the systematic delegitimation of the state right across the OECD. And the way this plays out in macro is, supply side dominance and monetary dominance. So, fiscal policy, which used to run the show, you can't be trusted with it, and it has leads and lags. That used to be monetary policy, now it's fiscal policy. You don't really know if it's going to work, blah, 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 or ultimately it's a waste because of people's expectations and they discount the effects, etc. So you shouldn't do anything. And then,
so, let's examine that shit. Literally, he is saying that over the last 40 years, since Ronald Reagan, there's been this delegitimization of the state, and the state can't do anything. And, we need to let business owners do it, or worse yet, we need to let one particular person fix it. This is the same reason why you have such an hostility against someone like Bernie Sanders, who says, let's do Medicare for all, the same system that we're doing for our vets, or the same system we're doing for our elderly. Well, the state can't do it. We've been doing it. And private business hasn't been doing it well at all. It is no reason why you should have medical bankruptcies. No reason. It is no reason why people who work 40 fucking hours a week, sometimes more, should be struggling for, making sure that they can actually have enough food to fucking eat. But no, you have these people like Destiny, you have these people like all of these other neoliberals that say, well, the state can't do it. The policy that Bernie has about affordable housing, the state can't do that. Literally, you actually saw the the debate that Destiny had with Ben Burgess. And it's like he refused to acknowledge that it was talking about Bernie's housing plan, where if he was talking about how Bernie has a housing plan that would actually facilitate more building of homes for everyone. And Destiny says, well, investors are not going to build the homes if they can't spend the money. And Ben Burgess would actually say, finish the sentence, who can build the homes? Well, investors won't do it. Government can. If investors can't do anything, government can actually fucking help. And nobody's advocating for government to come around and say, well, you have to live in this fucking hobbit home. No! It is literally picking up the slack that fucking corporations can't or are not willing to do. But let's continue.
Then also you're incompetent, so you can't do anything. I know, oh, the state, it's for losers. There's makers and there's takers, and the state's just filled with takers. And all of these different sort of little sort of micro discourses which have become concatenated and layered over the past 30 years. And then if you think about it, particularly in the cases of the United States, and also to a certain extent the United Kingdom, you know, it used to be the case that if you worked in the Central Civil Service in Whitehall, that was an extraordinarily respected thing to do, and now you're just another lazy government bureaucrat, right? You know, you're not out there in the private sector, you're in the protected sector.
Wow, it's become a bad thing, and he just said it. It's become a bad thing that you work for the government. Oh joy! Like, would you want your healthcare run like the DMV? Long lines and waiting. At least with the fucking DMV, they're guaranteed to fucking see me no matter what. I just pay a small nominal fee to get a fucking license versus dealing with, you know, I don't know, a healthcare company that says, no, you got to wait 30 days in order to make sure that a payment is processed. And then we're just going to keep you in limbo. And while we're keeping you in limbo, the people that actually facilitate the service is going to be chasing you down because they're concerned that you may not pay them or they may not get paid. Fuck out of here.
You're trading off security against income rather than actually providing public goods, doing incredibly important enforcement and regulation that actually makes markets work better for everyone. So there's been an enormous turnaround in the way that we talk about the state, which has been massively consequential. That has been a project of the right, but it was embraced by the left almost as an electoral strategy. And you saw that most clearly with the Gerhard Schroeder, Tony Blair period, whereby the whole state became enabling, poverty disappeared, it became social exclusion, etc. And those languages, again, although non-economic, have deep economic roots and economic consequences.
But do you think that there's a deep crisis in our existing economic paradigms, particularly in relation to the dominant monetary paradigm, given that the central bank has intervened so much and committed so much public resources to bailing out the private sector, that suddenly we're in a world whereby, well, what's going to happen next?
So I'm having a conversation with a Swiss economic historian about this stuff, and we're going to do a conference.
Please let that be, fuck. What is that dude's called? The guy who spoke up in Davos. Brucker Reckman. I got a video on my channel.
We're doing it with a conference called the bystander hypothesis. And it's because there's all this work now on long-term interest rates. And those interest rates basically start... We have a record from about 13, 15, and they're about 12% real. And they just go down and down and down and down. And if you look at it over the short term, the volatility is huge. You know, wars, crises, plagues, famine, right? But if you look at the long-run linear trend, it's straight down. Now, there's a whole branch of economic history about the revolution in military affairs, the fiscal capacity of the state. Charles Tilley brought this into sociology, all this good stuff. And that's how we think about, you know, why bond markets exist, because they needed to fight wars, so they needed to give creditors better protection, blah, blah, blah. But there's a whole bunch of countries that didn't do that. and their rates went down as well. Now, there's an analog to this for central banks. So central banks appear on the scene as independent central banks in the 1980s, primarily spreading in the 1990s. Juliet Johnson's book is, of course, the Bible on this stuff. And the essential claim is inflation is always and everywhere a present danger, and we need to be the police. We're out there to get it. And then it looks like interest rates are down, and volatility is down in general, and inflation is down. So Bernanke writes The Great Moderation, and then the whole world blows up. But despite the whole world blowing up, and despite 20% equivalent of the global money supply being chucked into the global money supply, so basically 17 to 20 trillion dollars extra being shoved in direct intervention, inflation continues to go down, and as a consequence, interest rates continue their long decline.
So, okay, I get it. A lot of this shit is intermediate level shit. So, what happened during the financial crisis and the recovery is that everybody was so scared about inflation actually coming around, and like no one wanted to repeat what happened in the 70s, even though we have evidence that what happened in the 70s was an anomaly, not the norm. That's what he said. He said that inflation over time has gone completely down. It's going in the toilet. But no one wants to repeat that shit. And so, specifically, they've been people who have had control of monetary policies have been trying to fight inflation everywhere. When we had the financial crisis, not just here in the U.S., but across the globe, banks start printing fucking money. And everybody was worried about inflation. Everybody was worried about inflation. And yet, there is none. There is no inflation anywhere. No inflation anywhere. But yet and still, everybody is so worried about it. But let's continue.
So my big question is this. Are central banks bystanders? So it's way beyond, are we in a world which their capacities aren't there now? Maybe they never really did that much. They were kind of, if you will, performing their role, but the world was disinflating because inflations are actually incredibly unusual unless you have state collapse and hyperinflation and warfare. So given most people most of the time in the developed world are not in that state, you had this unusual inflation in the 1970s for reasons we can get into. And then once that was bust in the 1980s through monetary action, through Volcker and others jacking up interest rates, down and down and down and down and down they went. And that's where we are now. So you build these central banks with these capacities and independence and credibility, and I can't help but wonder if they're just bystanders.
Or just sitting at the top of the pyramid, in the sense of, so you talk about central banks being independent from government, and you talk about kind of the consumer price inflation, as you say, is going down. But asset price inflation is not. And the interventions of central banks in the aftermath of the crisis have driven up the price of assets. So in that sense, they have a role to play, but it begs the question, to what extent are central banks independent from the financial market and the banks that they regulate?
Absolutely. And so a really important point that we need to clarify is an inflation is an increase in the general level of all prices. When you use the word inflation, that's what it means. There is no such thing as asset price inflation.
So just breaking that down for a little bit. So inflation, when you actually talk about it, yes, it actually is an overall increase of prices like we had in the 70s where everything was going up. But the only thing that a lot of people are actually going up is fucking housing, property. Not just generally like a lot of, everyday prices. For example, I'm playing on a fucking 52-inch screen TV. 10 years ago, this would have been $2,000. Now it's like $500. So inflation is going nowhere. Nowhere. But rental properties are going up. The inflation of that is going up. The inflation that you see with people are, when it comes to when it comes to land and homes and shit, that's going up. Stock prices are going up. But just normal inflation anywhere, not going anywhere. But let's continue.
Asset prices go up because there's an enormous inequality skew, and people are buying assets because they expect a higher income stream of returns from the purchase of those assets in the future as opposed to the present. That's not an inflation. Now, I'm not being a pedant about this, right? I think it's really important to make that distinction, because it's absolutely the case that in order to stabilize inflation or inflationary expectations, if you want to go down that route, what the central banks have been doing is quantitative easing and asset purchases and all that sort of stuff, and that's led to all sorts of distortions and perhaps some inequality, etc., etc. But they're not causing an inflation. Right, and we use that language too carelessly. The problem that we have structurally is disinflation, if not deflation, particularly in Europe. It may be the case that assets classes, stocks, shares, and housing in particular are going through the roof, but that's because the world's phenomenally unequal. And in a world in which you get negative real rates by sticking your money in the bank, people want positive rates. What do? They buy houses, right?
So this actually addresses one other thing. You actually see, and in some cases, there have been plans. In Germany, there is a negative interest rate that is happening that they're trying to actually do because people are saving so much money that they're trying to get them to spend money. And Trump actually proposed negative interest rates because it fosters people to spend money because that's keeping off a fucking recession. But let's continue.
So it's a very different thing. And the central banks are part of that, but I see them as, rather than producing that problem, they might have amplified in one or two ways. But again, this is the long-run structural story. If interest rates are going through the floor and you get nothing sticking it in the Sparkasse and you're German savers and you think you've got a God-given right to 4% real just for showing up, you better find something else to make your returns. And that's what's been going on.
So you've written a bit about, the shift in macroeconomic regimes whereby the Keynesian commitment to full employment, the monetarist commitment to price stability, and you've just clearly outlined that, this commitment is problematic now. So where next? What's the next phase? What's the next paradigm shift here?
So to me, the two things. The only thing that matters, and I'm being perfectly serious when I say this, is climate change. Right? Everything else, given what we're seeing in terms of increasing feedback effects and sort of things that were meant to happen 90 years from now, like Anchorage, Alaska being 94 degrees and all that sort of fun stuff, and every summer is the hottest summer that we have, etc. You're getting to the point that you can talk about within, not just within our lifetimes, within a decade, the destabilization of the glaciers of Europe, which then basically screws up all French and German agriculture. I mean, these are pretty serious stuff.
So that's actually a very interesting point. The fact that he's actually talking about how fucking climate change not only will affect our kids later on down the line, they're happening now. I was just watching a Netflix show where Ragnarok, where that's part of it. We have measured effects that we see that this is happening, and we're going to start seeing, and we already have started seeing, climate refugees. There's a few tens of thousands, but eventually there will be millions.
So the next frontier, and it's interesting, let's go back to central banks. We've got politicians that are either in denial because they're paid off, or don't want to think about it because it's too hard given a short-term electoral calculus, who are being embarrassed into action by basically things such as Greta Thunberg or alternatively the Amazon fires or public opinion. They don't really know what to do or how to get out of this problem, so they choose to just ignore it. And it's kind of interesting that the central banks have been quite vocal about this. Now, we can think of them as regulating financial markets, enabling financial...
You're right, Wajida. There are people that not only have their switched around and says, well, it's not happening. There are people that turned around, well, since it's happening, it's nothing we can do about it. Literally, there are people that are like that right now. Well, we know it's happening, then there's nothing we can do about it. Fuck out of here.
Financial markets are being captured by financial markets. I think of this as the regulation and enabling mode. What they're basically signaling is the problem of stranded assets. Carbon assets in particular. And here's what I mean by stranded assets, right? So I have a house in South Florida, for example. And South Florida is lovely, it's got beaches, all that sort of stuff. But you know that the beaches are going to go, and you know there's going to be floods. And once the flood happens 3 times, you're out. And then there's no buyer for those houses. Doesn't matter if your house has never been flooded, nobody's buying, right? So think about carbon assets. Think about we shoot through 1.5%, governments finally pull on the brakes, say that's it, you know, the oil majors, turns out they were the ones spreading all this crap about climate change and disinformation, no different from the tobacco companies, they're the ones that need to pay for green tech, blah, blah, blah. What happens if you're a bourse that's heavy carbon? What happens if your portfolio for your retirement has got Exxon in it? Because everybody does, right? So I think the financial markets recognize this. And just as in a sense, the state acted, to use that great Marxist term, as the ideal collective capitalist during a financial crisis to save everyone's assets, the central banks are now doing that in a forward-looking way, saying, hey, we need to take this climate stuff seriously, because if not, it's going to destroy the values of everything.
So this is actually mirroring some of the shit that has been brought up this year in Davos. You can actually find videos where people are actually saying, like, we know the party is almost over. Let's try to capitalize on it. Now, are they still trying to capitalize it in a way where they would keep their power? Yes. Fucking of course, yes. But they're still recognizing that we're getting fucked. Slowly. Passionately. But let's continue.
So to me, it's kind of fascinating that the only bit of the political system, because they are political actors, that really are paying attention is actually the central banks.
So central banks could intervene to change what though, exactly?
Well, that's the thing. It's not clear exactly what they can do. I mean, they can raise the alarm and so on and so forth. What you really need is concerted action by institutional investors. And there's been some of that has been going on. There was a large conference in London of institutional investors basically saying that they're not going to invest in certain carbon risk assets, etc. last year to the tune of several $100 billion. So there is some movement on that. The central banks, you know, what do? They talk, they signal. That's what they do. Actually, I'll tell you a funny list. You ever hear about the paper from New Zealand about inflation expectations?
No.
So I'll try and dig this out and send it to you. So they've been doing inflation targeting in New Zealand longer than anyone else, right? So the whole point of this is the claim that there's sort of 2 ways of thinking about inflation. One is a simple quantitative monetary effect, right, which relies on money not being generated by banks per se as credit, but as central bank money qua base reserves and multiplication in a banking system, whatever, right? And then all that sort of stuff. So basically inflation is caused by too much money. Now there's another one that says...
Wow, if that's a easy way to actually describe what inflation is actually caused by, too much money.
There's no expectations. People expect prices to go up and that becomes embedded and all that sort of stuff, right? So taking the expectation stuff seriously, which is what most of modern macro takes seriously, and I take expectations seriously, it relies upon ordinary members of the public giving a shit. And actually paying attention to this and understanding what the signal is and seeking out the signal. And we assume that happens, but do we have any evidence? Well, this paper in New Zealand is brilliant. So they basically did massive Google searches to find out if anyone in New Zealand actually ever went to the central bank website and tried to look at inflation numbers, whatever. And I think the number was you were 10,000 times more likely to look at any video sent to you from YouTube than you were to look at a central bank signal.
Wow.
So, you know, again, what exactly are they doing and who's listening?
Yeah. So just to bring it back in the political science dimension for a moment, you have written that the policy response to the international financial crises gave rise to the conditions that led to Donald Trump Brexit.
Global Trumpism.
Yeah, he's actually the person that coined the global Trumpism. But let's continue.
As I called it, yes.
You might elaborate on that and for our listeners.
Well, I think everybody's kind of got to that position now. I was just sort of a little bit ahead of the curve on this one, that, you know, if you run a world that's massively skewed in terms of an inequality skew for 30 years, you fill in the gap with credit. You have a massive financial crisis. You suddenly then discover that what banks talk about when they talk about assets is actually everybody else's liabilities. So the banks get bailed, which basically means that your liabilities are kept whole, but your job just went bang. Your income hasn't grown in some cases, depending on where you are in the income distribution, for 30 years. Although there's no inflation, prices of the big stuff that really matters, healthcare, particularly in the United States, education, goods, etc., are going through the roof. And you're being told by the chattering classes on the coasts who have got all the real estate and all the wealth that everything's fine. And we're, in the case of America, celebrating Obama's legacy. And it turned out lots of people didn't think that legacy was all it was cracked up to be. Or alternatively, in the United Kingdom, as we know now, that the brunt of austerity fell on local and regional governments in the United Kingdom.
So let's actually just address this. And this was what I was talking about earlier. There were people who voted for Trump because at least he was saying it's not all okay. Literally, Hillary Clinton ran on the campaign of everything is great and it's all going to work. This is one of the reasons why the whole neoliberal thing about Joe Biden is going to come and rescue us and return shit back to normality. That's the reason why it's not working. Because people know that 10 years ago, you can actually get a 2-bedroom apartment for $700. Now I have my rent is over $1,000 for the same shit. Excuse me. That I used to get for $750. Because yes, prices for electronics or different things have fucking going down. It was a story about the PS4. A PS5 is going to actually be a lot less than what people thought. But the shit like going to school, healthcare, those prices are going through the fucking roof. So, of course people are going to be mad. The vote for Trump was a brick through the fucking establishment. That's what the vote for Trump was. It was people throwing a brick through the fucking establishment. But let's continue.
Preston in the north of England suffered a 30% cut in real terms, and that wasn't that unusual in terms of the swinging cuts. Meanwhile, metropolitan London was pretty much unscathed. So the provinces were burned to save the assets of the rich. And then along come Brexit, whereby the entire British ruling class link arms and tell the people who have just been massively hurt by those same people that everything's great, we should stay in the EU. I mean, do we need to have more complex explanations in this? It's been 30 years in the making.
So it's basically austerity. It's the austerity response, and there's a lot of research published on that now in the UK. That effectively,
yeah, the Fetzer paper and a whole bunch of stuff, absolutely. But I tend to think of that as, not this. Eric Lonergan and I've done some stuff on this. It wasn't caused by the financial crisis, but it was all just waiting for the financial crisis to cause it, right? And I'm not being clever when I say that. What I mean is, it was all there. All the ingredients of the cake were there. And the settlement that kept it going, the continual expansion of credit to people who could barely make the payments, that was just had to go.
So, and this is another key thing, and I know he talks about this a lot, but because wages couldn't go up, people actually lived on credit. Credit for in things that you wouldn't think were just credit. For instance, you can buy vehicles used to be able to buy vehicles without taking a loan out. And I'm not talking about some shitty vehicle that you get around tax time. You can buy homes that you didn't have to take this big, huge loan out. That's living on credit. When he said that your assets, like your house, your car, they're your assets. They're the bank's liability. And the bank's in your liability, the payments you owe, is the bank's assets. That's what he means. And for motherfuckers to say, oh, everything is working fine, and not see that fucking people are struggling. This is the reason why Trump won. And this is the reason why Sanders is actually motherfucking making a path to the nomination of presidency. Shit, this is the reason why the Yang Gang exists. Because Yang says, we're going to give you money. People are hurting. But yet and still, you get these elites to say, no, everything is fine. Everything is working out great. But let's continue.
And eventually when it did, I mean, in a sense, there should have been a bigger reset of the system. But the central bank came in and bailed the system. So in a sense, we gave a massive liquidity injection to a system that had just had a liquidity heart attack. And we put it back together again. But now you're 10 years out and the politics has changed. And the politics have changed massively. I mean, if you think about you go to the G7 now, right? You know, you're looking at, was Salvini actually there?
I don't.
Did they actually? No, he doesn't get in the 7. He'd be in the G10, right? So imagine if you're a G10, right? Who would you have? Well, you probably have, you know, Trump. You got Johnson. You might have Salvini, right? I mean, the political forces have been radically rearranged.
Given that the state committed so much public resources to bailing out the private sector, those same public resources could be committed to healthcare, education, public infrastructure, childcare, climate action. And we know from public opinion that, broadly speaking, people are favourable towards those social democratic policies. So the conditions should have been ripe for the left to have a response to this, but they didn't, and it's the left that are suffering. What explains that?
Well, one of the things you can think about is in many cases, the putative left, whether they were left or not, was actually in charge when it all went down. So Britain is a classic example of this. And what did they do? They bailed the banks. Because they were said, you know, too big to fail, etc., be catastrophe, whether it is or not is an open question. But it was the left that in many cases, you know, did this. And that invited the right-wing critique of the Tea Party and others, which was, this isn't capitalism. And in that case, they're completely right. I mean, you were socializing the risk and you were meting out punishment instead of reward. And
this is like one of the things that you see Cenk Uygur says. A lot of times these companies privatize the gains, privatize the profits, but socialize the loss, socialize the risk. And I'm not right-wing, but I recognize the fact that populism is a fucking thing. And this is, again, one of the reasons why the establishment hates Bernie. Because he critiques them from the fucking left. But let's continue. This is almost over. And the stream is almost over, guys.
And, you know, you can understand why then there's a loss of left credibility with this. If you will, the sort of the Blairite Schroeder project, if you will, the Obama project, the Clinton project, was essentially to disassociate yourself from working class organizations and try and find the nice people in the financial sector. And it turned out when you do that and everything goes bad, you then bail out your nice friends in the financial sector and you suffer, quite rightly, a massive loss of credibility. That credibility takes time to be rebuilt. I mean, we see this with what happened with the British Labour Party with Corbyn. There was a marvellous bit when I was in Britain when they were doing the leadership election. And we'll go back and remember how this happened. Corbyn was put on as a sop to the left by the people who ran the party. And they had 4 super mainstream, totally Blairite candidates. I think 2 women and two men. And there was one of the London radio stations had a whole bunch of them on, including Corbyn. And they asked them about what they would do with Miliband. He's lost the election, and now you're going to have a leader. You know, do you have him back in government? And they all gave these convoluted answers and blah, 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 and wouldn't answer the question. And Corbyn pipes up and says, well, he did a great job when he was environment spokesman. I'm going to have him back in a heartbeat. And the person running the radio show went, that's why he's going to win. Because people are just fed up with the type of answers you people give. And there's a huge amount of information in that little exchange. And, you know, whatever you think of the Corbyn project, I mean, he quadrupled Labour Party membership. And
so, yes, with Corbyn, he lost the Brexit election. Yeah, he did. But motherfucker built back up the fucking left in Britain. Now, in a lot of the establishment, again, was so gun-ho for him. But they left. He built it up so it can actually become so much better than what it was before. And I would actually be looking forward to actually seeing how that actually plays out in the end. Because it'd be the same thing as Bernie actually not being able to win the presidency this time. But he's left an indelic legacy where so many people are following in his footsteps. It may actually be, you may see the next time that in London, you may see the legacy of Corbyn, even though he's not the leader of the party. Well, and we see what happened in 2016 with Bernie Sanders when he came out and actually was, hey, this is wrong, the indictment of the system. That you see, though, he lost the election, but in 2018, you see so many progressives actually take hold. And now that's paid for dividends with his current presidential run. But let's continue.
Although the wheels seem to have come off the wagon a bit recently, being wrong-footed by Boris mainly. But any other social democratic leader that would quadruple the membership would be hailed as a hero, as opposed to some kind of, terrorist who confuses Hamas and hummus, which is where we are just now. So I think that the left, by associating itself very much with the neoliberal project, suffered an enormous credibility deficit and also has an impoverishment of ideas because, when you hang around with those folks and, you're backing those folks up, you accept their version of the world. And when it turns out it goes pants and you don't have any alternative, then, your credibility deficit gets worse. So I don't think it's that people have this weird thing going on where they have these preferences but they're unable to articulate them. It really is a case that the political parties and other organizations that supposedly represent those preferences actually don't. And a lot of what the populist reaction is essentially coming to terms with that. And it is worth remembering that even though it's on the back foot at the moment, there is a left populism as well as a right populism.
Exactly.
It's just that we spend all our time on the right one because it's a bit more ugly and telegenic and newsworthy. But, Spain's not to be dismissed. Portugal's not to be dismissed. Half of Italy's not to be dismissed. Corbyn maybe should be dismissed at this point. We don't know. We'll see. But it's more than just the right, and it's important to remember that.
Yeah. So we're here for a...
So, and here's a fun part about it. If you watch any of the if you watch any politics, you actually see that play out here in the U.S. Here, the Hill, Cristobal and Sagar. I don't want to mispronounce his last name. So it's Crystal and Sagar. Their new book, The New Populism. You see that a lot of these people are like, fuck the establishment. We may have disagreements, but we can agree on one thing. Fuck the establishment. And that's fucking key of what's going on. And if people in the establishment don't want to acknowledge that there is a populist tide running, well, Home Depot has some great deals on fucking pitchforks. But let's continue.
A workshop on kind of comparative political economy, international political economy after the financial crises, looking at the next stage, if you like, in terms of research program. In terms of the social science of all of this, where do you think we should be going?
So my motivation for helping to put this thing together is summed up in the paper that I did with Mark Schwartz, which basically asks the following question. It's quite plausible that these days, if you look around the world, you can see that countries under conditions of complex globalization have specialized. And they've had to. You have to find a way in the world. And countries that were traditionally exporters have become super exporters. And countries that were traditionally consumption-based have turbocharged that through debt and housing and all this sort of stuff. So we talk about different types of growth models. So here's the question. How does that come about? Is it simply a diffusion process? Is it more likely that it's diffusion plus some kind of hierarchical process? There's big countries pushing around small countries, right? Is there a project to this? Is there politics to this? Interesting thing that Herman put in the paper, Mark put in the paper. Similar thing is when you think about exporters, it's obvious to point out, well, there has to be somebody doing the importing. What's less obvious is what happens to the surplus. You need something to bank that with. So if you didn't have the dollar, you couldn't have any of this. So for me, the question is less, what bolted down paradigm do I believe in as the next thing, but how do we take a much more sort of multi-scalar view of this that allows us to think about how growth regimes or growth models are not just embedded in particular international arrangements, but how the entire thing acts as an ecosystem.
So that's actually a really good point. Going back to what we were saying earlier, what I was saying earlier about the 70s, about how it being a nationalized economies where there was a built-in cap. The world has been running on that system. Instead of taking a different approach, people have been taking the national system and actually grafting that upon the world. And just as he said that it doesn't work when you try to say the government is like a family, that approach doesn't affect everyone. The global approach with the national system with the global approach doesn't affect the same kind of way either. You can't just upscale it. You have to understand. And yes, there are some inconsistencies with imports, exports, but no one has actually sat down and says, well, it doesn't really work this way. Let's fine tune it. No, it's how do I make my money right now? It's my money and I need it now. Call J.G. Wentworth. I'm sorry.
So just to shout out for one of the papers, the one that we had on basically growth models in the environment, right, by Jonas Nam. This is a great little paper, and I encourage people to look at the full version when it's finally written up. But the short version of it basically says something really interesting. If you've specialized as an exporter, you can do green tech because you have the capability to build this stuff. But if you're a consumption-oriented place, even if you've got great politics, you kind of can't do it. Like, you physically can't do it. And also the coalitions to politically put that together aren't there because your growth model structured in a different way. And that's the type of thing that I think is really fascinating. There you have a global problem refracting through these different growth models, but actually telling us something about the world that we really didn't know. And ultimately, that is always the project of the social sciences. Tell me something I don't know.
And one thing that's fascinating to me is that on the one hand, we talk about nation states, national growth models, etc. But then you look more closely at the economic geography of all of this, and actually we're talking about cities, metropolitan areas, and this is the kind of link into the global supply chains.
Totally.
And that obviously feeds into the politics that we're observing at the moment within countries. So whilst on the one hand cities, regions are tapping into the broader international economy, they still operate within nationally bounded democratic spaces.
I mean, Ireland's a
So yeah, and see, this is what I'm saying. It's like this other system is actually in place, and maybe I'm double talking because I'm tired, but you can't work the global system like you would a national economy. You can actually take a global system as if it's made up of national economies, and then you can actually try to figure it out from this. But it's one of those things. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's an emergent issue, not just saying, well, we have A plus B and of course it's going to equal C. No, it's different than that. But let's continue.
Fascinating case of this, but by virtue of its scale. So, I mean, what's the population? 4.5 million?
Well, if you include the North of Ireland 5, but say the Republic of Ireland 4.5
Right,
million.
4.5 million, right. So how many is Dublin?
1.5.
So Greater Dublin, including the wealthy bits, 2?
Yeah.
Right, so half the country is
Yeah.
almost a metropole. And that metropole, as your work has demonstrated, isn't just based on corporation tax anymore, right? This is real investment by real companies with real people with real skills doing real stuff. Platform economy, all this sort of stuff, right? So that's an entire, if you will, new growth model that has emerged because of a bunch of historical and technological accidents and changes that happened elsewhere. Right. In 2016, I did a piece in European Journal of Economics where I tried to coin a term which doesn't seem to have caught on, possibly because it has bad connotations. But I refer to basically the area from Finland down through Sweden into Germany to Slovenia and then out to Romania as the greater German export complex, which it is. Well, you can think about that as a thing And then think about basically the Chinese manufacturing areas, the coastal manufacturing areas. And then you can think basically about the American heartland through Texas, the bits that are still manufacturing. And when you consider that manufacturing is still 11% of the American economy, let's call it 10, right? That means it's a 2 trillion sector. That means that sector is half of the size of half of the German GDP. So not to be sniffed at. You could basically take those as your analytic units and tell a really interesting story about the global economy. So it's how do we choose our units?
Yeah.
What's the costs and benefits of going one way rather than the other? I think that's where we're going to be going for the next few years.
Yeah. Final question, Mark.
Okay.
So,
final question, and then we're going to call this stream.
this podcast series is part of a series we're putting together on the new political economy of Europe at the Jean Monnet Centre at University College Dublin. Looking more concretely just at the European political economy. You've published a lot on this, you've on austerity, the policy response and so forth. Where do you see things panning out in the next decade?
So I think that the problematic part of the world for the next 10 years is Europe. And I don't say this with any joy in my heart. I think it's a sort of a tragedy. And a very simple way to think about it is it's the old problem of irresistible forces and immovable objects. And you've basically got an institutional order that says the supply side does everything. Structural reform is the only thing you can do. We went through a massive recession and now we all need to tighten. Everybody needs to become an exporter. It just doesn't add up. Now, imagine an incredibly benign world environment of high growth. You might get away with that. Well, at least at the levels that we see now. But if you read China's 2025, they're coming after the Mittelstand. So that export surplus is going to be reduced. And if that's the only bit that's causing growth, you've got a problem. And then you got on the other side of here the possibility of Trump winning again. And if he does, it's quite clear that the tariff war that he's having with China is going to be extended to Europe. Now, throw in a few other things. There's no such thing as a European digital platform. Sorry, everyone, Skype is owned by Microsoft, right? So the world has been pooled between these two increasingly hostile blocks, and Europe's caught in the middle with bad governance, weak governance, and, in my opinion, a massively wrong macro settlement that's trying to run a surplus against the rest of the world, banking somebody else's financial assets while doing so. I don't see that one going well. So even if the United States and China come to a modus vivendi, it's not clear that modus vivendi is going to help Europe.
Now, I know it's an overly simple way of putting it, but in that case, more or less European integration?
Well, this is it. I mean, the answer is simple, and it's gouvernement économique, right? Whatever Macron was hawking is what should be done. And then the problem is 9, 9, 9, 9, vielleicht 9, right? So we're not going to do any of that, and we'll do the lowest common denominator thing. I mean, if you can't even really complete your banking union, so that you don't have to do what you did last time when the banks went bust. If you can't agree on a substantial common insurance policy for unemployment so that people feel that they really have skin in the game, right? As a sort of, yes, European money insures me and insures my future as opposed to national, then you're just playing at the margins, and they're very much playing at the margins. I had a conversation with someone from the
So let me just make sure I understand what he's actually coming at right now. The faith in, like, the EU, European Union, has built up so much faith in the fucking euro that it's also almost to a detriment. And you have two economic powers, France and Germany, who are, and of course, it's always France and Germany. If you actually ever watch the extra history, you'll know that it started because of the Holy Roman Empire and the division of the crown and all the other good shit. But you have two European powers that are just looking to control the market in the financial war. And yet and still, this whole split is probably one of the reasons why you actually see so much, because for a while Germany was actually controlling a lot of things, but it's only so long that Merkel can actually stay in power to rein in or influence the things that's happening in Deutsche Bank. Because let's be honest, Deutsche Bank is holding the purse for a lot of people. But let's continue.
ESM on the sidelines of a conference recently, and they got very agitated that I was quite down about Europe, because all they could say was, but the spreads are down, but the spreads are down, but the spreads are down. It's like, well, if that's the only thing you look at, then it's really hard to understand why Salvini is so popular. There's more going on than just the spreads.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, thank you very much for this podcast. It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I'm surprised you didn't ask me why I was an Everton fan.
Why are you an Everton fan?
Later.
All right, so we done a lot of videos today. I want to thank everybody who's watched tonight. Last day of my day before vacation, my last day before I got to go back to work from vacation. This is gonna be fucking soul sucking. If you want to motherfucking help me, where I can actually help more with supporting myself with doing streams, you can actually check the link out in the chat, and of course, you can actually check out my art. So, and by the way, Jill, I do draw women with clothes on. They're just not the fun drawing. All right. So check out my links below. I'm going to actually cut this shit up. If you watch today or if you want to watch it at a later time, I'm going to cut this shit up where I can actually put it in each distinctive videos. I want to thank everybody who's watched and enjoy the rest of your evening. Peace.